Hey y'all, welcome to Sandy's Library. I'm Sandy, and in this video I'm going to tell y'all about a little incident that I like to call the religion wars. And just as a quick FYI, if you need visuals for who these people were, there are links posted in the description outlining both of my grandparents' family trees. And I just want to say real quick, I'm stumbling over my words this morning, but hopefully you guys will just bear with me because I don't have the luxury of waiting for a day when I feel better. So, also, for full disclosure, you should know that over the course of my childhood, I have never heard this particular family tale before reading it in our half-cousin's manuscript. The principal characters in the story are Julia Wheat Williams and Jim Riley on the Baptist side, and on the RLDS or Saints side are Willie L. Williams, Julia's son, and his wife Lizzie, and Lizzie's parents, Marion Fuller and Belle Hawkins Fuller. And finally, the visiting preacher, Brother J.W. Jackson, who was invited to the Beret community in Ashley County, Arkansas by Marion Fuller. And it's worth noting that in our half-cousin's manuscript, he relays two different versions of said story as if they are one and the same. So, pulling those details out of his convoluted manuscript wasn't easy because in the first half of the manuscript he tells one story, but in the back half of his 500 front and back page single-space 12-point Times New Roman manuscript, he has one brief paragraph that tells a completely different story to which he references the first version for more details. So, not only are we left to decide if this story is true or not, but now we have to decide which version is the truth. It's also worth noting that in the first version of the story, our half-cousin gives no dates whatsoever for when the story might have taken place, although he does name a year in the short paragraph at the end of the book. And just real quick, if you fancy yourself being able to record your family history in a manuscript, yet you've never written anything beyond a text message or an email, maybe a grocery list, do your relatives a favor and take a few writing classes first. That's all I'm saying. And y'all know me, I take everything with a grain of salt, so we'd better establish a few facts before we get started. And since I had no date to work with when running across a story in the first half of our half-cousin's manuscript, I decided finding that out was a good place to start. And since there are historical records available to us these days, I figured I had as good a shot as any in establishing when this chain of events might have occurred. So, in light of all the confusion in our half-cousin's convoluted manuscript, let's take a look at some historical facts before we get into the nuts and bolts of the story. It's a fact that Willie, Lizzie, and 5 children, Julia Bell, Ina, Alma, Viola, and Jeff, were listed on the 1900 census in Jackson Parish, Louisiana, Precinct 1, Ward 1. The census date was June 6, 1900. My grandmother's younger brother, Jeff, was born in November of 1899, and on the census, he's listed as being born in Louisiana. Plus, that's what Uncle Jeff always said, that he was born in Louisiana. It's also worth noting that on the same census page, 5 or 6 houses down, is Jim Fuller. He was Lizzie's uncle. And Francis and Isabella Fuller are also in Jackson Parish, Precinct 1, Ward 1. Their census date was June 2nd, 1900. So, the 1900 census supports the idea that both families left Arkansas, and probably during the year 1898 or early 1899, since Uncle Jeff was born in Louisiana in November. Okay, so in this story, it said there were 2 infants who were nearly caught in the crossfire of these religion wars. Both children were reported to be Marion and Belle Fuller's grandchildren, and one of them was said to be Willie's child. One of the babies was identified as Marvin Johnson, my grandmother's first cousin, and it's worth noting that both children were only ever referred to as infants and babies in the genealogical notes of the story, and that adds its own level of confusion. Sorry guys, my neighbor is out on his bike, I see. But anyway, we know that Marvin Johnson was born August 15, 1896 in Berea, Ashley County, Arkansas. So, taking that into account, my grandmother, Viola, was born January 5th, 1897, also in Berea. And if you do the math, Marvin was about 4.5 months older than my grandmother, Sissy. And her next sibling back is Uncle Bud, or Alma, born January 6th, 1895. So, depending upon what the original storyteller deemed as infants, this particular incident could have happened between September of 1896 and the first few months of 1897. If the children were truly infants, then it most likely happened in 1897, because in the fall of 1896, Uncle Bud was closing in on 2 years old, which he would have turned right after the upcoming New Year. That's hardly an infant. So I'm inclined to believe that Willie's infant was most likely my grandmother, as Uncle Jeff was born in Louisiana in 1899, which would support the family tale if my dates are correct. Either way, I believe the incident happened in either the fall of 1896 involving Uncle Bud and Marvin Johnson, or sometime in early 1897 involving my grandmother and Marvin Johnson. The initial confrontation, which is said to have led up to the incident with the children, was reported to have happened some weeks earlier. The genealogical notes suggest that it was this initial event that ignited what I like to call the religion wars. In our tale, the Mount Olive Baptist Church was the dominant church in the Berea community at the time. The family tales proclaim that the church was established about 1857. Online church records state that the church building was dedicated May 11th, 1859, so it's within the realm of possibility that 1857 is a fair assessment of the time frame. It's also worth noting that I did find info online stating that the church is now defunct, that it was disbanded in the early 1960s. But you know, establishing the exact date that the church was formed is not important to this story, because from two simple facts in the genealogical notes. One, the report of 2 infants in the tale, and one is identified as Marvin Johnson. And secondly, the fact that Aunt Julie Bell reportedly recalled remembering that her mother and other women were sewing garments meant to hide the saints' identities. From these 2 facts, we can surmise that since Marvin was born in 1896, and Julie Bell had to be old enough to remember the sewing, she turned 7 on December 28, 1896, plenty old enough to remember such an event, which supports my dates of late 1896 or the first half of 1897. Our half-cousin's manuscript did include some of the Mount Olive Church minutes, which I did confirm, that say Julia Wheat, W.B. Wheat, which was her father, and Lawrence Williams, among others, were baptized on August 4th, 1862 in Ashley County, Arkansas. This was about 6 years before Lawrence and Julia married. So, she was about 14 at the time, while Lawrence was in his early 20s. And the fact that he didn't marry until he was like 30-ish, well, it does make me wonder about him. Based on his photo over here, you know, and that's believed to be him in his Civil War uniform, he wasn't a bad-looking guy, and he did have striking eyes, so I'm sure the girls chased him plenty. But anyway, As the story goes, and I'm going to read y'all exactly what our half-cousin wrote, because you need to hear it the way I saw it to understand where I'm coming from. So here's what he has to say. And y'all, I have corrected some of his grammars so we can understand it. As the Latter-day Saints began to grow in numbers, as members of the community, their need for a place to worship was brought to the attention of the Baptists. They offered to share the use of their church building with the saints. The Baptists agreed to hold their services on Sunday morning and allowed the RLDS to meet there in the afternoon. Thus, both groups would be able to worship the Lord in the community church building. This arrangement was to last until the saints could construct their own building. This went on for some time, although animosity began to grow in the community against the saints. Finally, a fight broke out between one of the saints, Jim Fuller, and a Baptist, Jim Riley. The community was outraged against the Latter-day Saints over the brawl between the two church group members. Some of the people blamed the saints and formed a secret mob to punish them. Okay, so let's just examine what we've just heard. So, first, I searched through the Mount Olive church records, which are now online, and while I did find record of them consolidating the Baptist Church with the Community of Christ Church in what they called a Central Church in the 1880s, there was no mention in any of the transcribed minutes of them sharing their building with the RLDS people. It's worth noting that numerous months are missing in the church's minutes, from late 1896 through 1898, and for me, this further corroborates my theories. I mean, if they recorded their dirty deeds in the church minutes, I could see why somebody came along after the fact and removed them. Like my grandpa always used to say, never put anything incriminating in writing. In these online church minutes, I found just one record mentioning the saints or the RLDS church. It reads as follows: Mount Olive Church, December 27th, 1902. Brother John Williams was the ringleader of a committee that's been appointed to go see Sister Ella Riles to see if she still desires to remain in the church, as she has united herself with the Latter-day Saints. There is also mention that Sister Riles was reinstated. Mount Olive Church, January 24th, 1903. The minutes read, after services, Brother Berth White, united with us by letter from Hopewell Church, moved that Sister Riles be reinstated in the church. And y'all, I believe that the Ella Riles that they're talking about in these church minutes, I think she was Willie's sister Ella, who married William David Ryle, no S, in 1900. I theorize that Ella might have been on her brother's side during the attacks, but after Willie's family left the state with his in-laws, the Fullers, she might have gone back to her mother's church, perhaps asking forgiveness. I can see how that could happen. And y'all, remember that name Jim Riley? The one who supposedly got into a fight with Jim Fuller? Take a look at this passage that I found. Saturday, February 4th, 1889. Brother J.R. Riley stated that he had been guilty of drinking too much. Said that he was sorry for it and asked the church to bear with him. The church agreed to bear with him. Brother W.S. Allen also made the same statement. Also stated that he had been engaged in a combat with some other man, asked church to bear with him, and he would try not to do it again. The church agreed. Okay, so looks to me like brothers J.R. Riley and W.S. Allen have a history of carousing, drinking, and fighting. So I have to ask myself, if all these good Christian men and women who were supposed to be sharing this community building so they could all worship the Lord, then where did the animosity for the saints come from? Good question, right? But this video is probably long enough. So we're going to explore that concept in part 2 of the religion wars. So stay tuned. Later, Gators.